Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Michigan Works Association 2020 Annual Conference. My name is Jeff Cassidy. I'm the Director of Policy with the Michigan Works Association. On behalf of the staff of the association and all of our sponsors, we thank you for being a part of the conference in this session titled Military Cultural Competence. A big shout out of thanks to the Oakland County Michigan Works for sponsoring today's workshop. Sponsors help make this conference happen, and we're very thankful for their support. Along with our sponsors are exhibitors who have also given their time to be a part of our event. So be sure to visit the exhibitor booths during the designated exhibit hall times. Before we begin today's session, there's a few housekeeping items I'd like to share with you. Please make sure that your audio is muted. We will have an opportunity for questions and answers. Go ahead and put your question topics in the chat, and I'll provide them for the end of after the presentation. We are eager for your feedback about the conference and about this session, so please take a few moments to complete the short survey. I'll put the survey link in the chat as well. And presentations will be available post-conference on the Michigan Works Association website. And now I would like to introduce your speaker for this session, Dave Dunckle, retired Command Sergeant Major, Strategy Specialist with the Michigan Veterans Affairs Agency. Dave?
Well, good morning, everybody. And I'm not wearing a tie like Jeff this morning. It took everything I had to put a dress shirt on, and it's untucked. A couple administrative notes. This probably will not take an hour, probably take about 40 minutes, so you might get 20 minutes back of your time. I have multiple monitors here, so if I turn my head, it's not that I'm being distracted or ignoring you, it's that I got Zoom over here, I got my presentation up here, I got my camera right here, so there'll be a little bit of that going on. I'm really proud that this is the fifth year that I've presented at the Michigan Works Conference, fifth consecutive year. And almost every year I talk about the value of hiring veterans and veteran talent attraction strategies. And this year I thought, let's just talk about where veterans come from. What's the culture that creates a veteran? What are the different rank structures in the military? What is the difference between the active component and the reserve component and their mission and their vision and their values? And I think you'll walk away with a little bit better understanding of what creates today's United States Armed Forces veteran. So why do you care? Let me go to the next slide. If you understand where veterans come from, you can better integrate them into your organization. You can provide better customer service for them at your Michigan Works Service Centers. It's just a better understanding of what created them in the first place. So like I said earlier, we're going to talk about military rank structure, some of the branches of service and the difference in their missions and their values, and active versus reserve component duties. So let's talk about Michigan's veteran population a little bit. There's about 550,000 veterans in the state of Michigan. That has this 30% decrease in the past 10 years. And that's because of our veteran population age. It's because of the propensity for young men and women to serve today. Less than 1% of the American population volunteers to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces. Where prior to this and past conflicts like Vietnam, for instance, there was conscription, there was a draft that created a tremendous amount of veterans, but that number is dwindling. And they figure by 2040, we're going to be down to about 325,000 veterans in Michigan. And that's why, as an agency, we focus a tremendous amount of our energy on attracting transitioning service members from the military to Michigan. We travel around the country, both virtually and physically, to visit transitioning service members and show them that Michigan is a great place to live, work, raise a family, and retire. We want to keep that veteran population strong. Michigan has one of the largest growing female veteran populations in the country with 43,000 female veterans. Most people don't realize that veterans have a pretty high level of education with over 30% of them having some college, and then 22% of them having a bachelor's degree or higher. Michigan is very unique in that 55% of our veterans are over age 65, and only 19% of the non-veteran population is over 65. So that shows that our veteran population, and this is true in most states, they're aging out of the workforce. That's why attracting these transitioning service members and their families to Michigan is so important. There's about 220,000 service members that leave the military each year. And if you look at the family members that are involved in that severance from the armed forces, that's about 1,300 people a day are leaving the U.S. Armed Forces and entering the civilian world, workplace, education, whatever the case may be. The majority of veterans in Michigan, because of their age, are Vietnam veterans. About 70% of those live down in the Tri-County region in Southeast Michigan. And that's because Detroit, like Chicago, like Los Angeles, like New York City, was disproportionately hit during the draft. A lot of young men from Detroit were drafted during the Vietnam War, and hence our veteran population reflects that 38%. Then we have Gulf War I and II, Korean War. Only 4% of our veterans are World War II veterans. And unfortunately, that's a population that is dwindling by the day. About 20% of our veterans, the second highest percentage, are veterans that served during peacetime. So for instance, the end of the Vietnam War to the beginning of Desert Storm in 1991. Those individuals are still considered veterans, but they're just not, they're not a special population of veterans as far as they can't be tied to a specific conflict like the other ones that are displayed there on the slide. Let's talk about some of the misconceptions that people have about veterans. That they're all walking time bombs, that they're riddled with post-traumatic stress and emotionally unstable. I'll be honest with you, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress by the Veterans Affairs Administration when I retired from the military after 26 years. And they have taken great care of me. I mean, I've been able to go to cognitive behavioral therapy, which was very, very helpful. I was able to talk with other veterans about the experiences that they had. And I think I was actually much better suited than a lot of people would be. There's a tremendous amount of people that do have post-traumatic stress that never served in the military. You and I have all worked with somebody that suffers from post-traumatic stress, but they just don't get labeled that way because they're not veterans. That veterans are rude and not very friendly. That's actually true. No, it's not true. Veterans are job hoppers. And it is true that the average veteran will take 2 or 3 jobs in the first 5 years after leaving service. But you look at the average college graduate, they take 2 or 3 jobs in the first 5 years after they leave college. So I think that's more of an indicator. That's a generational thing now, I think, more than it is specifically tied to any particular population. That veterans are mindless drones. You know, I can't count the number of individuals that have told me that they could never join the military because they don't want somebody telling them what to do. And in all reality, somebody tells us what to do all the time. We all have bosses. Excuse me. And individual initiative is extremely important in the armed forces. Well, my son was an E6 squad leader in Iraq. Had probably 7 or 8 years of military service at that time. And he would leave his forward operating base with a squad of 8 other soldiers. And he was entirely independent when they went out and did presence patrols and cordon and searches. And that kind of individual initiative is fostered in the military. It's encouraged in the military. It's not the military of the 1930s where everybody kind of was a mindless drone back then. The veterans are aggressive. Veterans are trained to be aggressive, but that's the key is that training. They're also trained on how to control that aggression. The entire United States military is designed to put a person with a rifle within 3 foot of the enemy. I mean, that's what it comes down to. It comes down to that individual soldier and that 3 foot of land that's in front of them. You have to have a certain aggressive nature to be able to accomplish that kind of mission. But it's a controlled aggression. It's a trained aggression. And we know, I think, better than a lot of people how to control that and when it's appropriate and when it's not. The veterans are all perfect. Veterans are people too. I mean, I can remember talking to hiring managers that had a veteran that didn't work out, and the hiring manager would actually turn to me and say, "Don't send me any more of those veterans. They just didn't work out." And in actuality, we've all had people that didn't work out. We've all had employees that didn't work out. So, yeah, veterans are not all perfect. They're humans just like everybody else. Some of the common transition issues that veterans face, it's very difficult. Leaving the military can sometimes be challenging. I did 26 years in the military, and I remember my first civilian job interview. It was for a tier 1 automotive supplier. And as I pulled in there and saw their big logo on the front of the building and saw people parking their cars and walking in and out, it literally dawned on me for the first time in 26 years that holy mackerel, people work in there. They spend their entire lives in there. I didn't really have a concept of what working in a civilian workplace was like. So it was pretty daunting and sometimes pretty scary. You're moving away from your friends and your family. Many times you're taking a pay cut when you leave the military. Little things that are difficult to think about, things like health insurance. I had health insurance, but it was provided to me by the government. If I got sick, I went to the on-base hospital if I needed to go. Same way with my family. A 401k, I didn't know anything about how a 401k worked. I mean, I had a pension when I left. But those kind of things are difficult. You'll see missing the rush in there. The military can be a very exciting place. You know, I've taken helicopters to work before, and you know, when you come out in the civilian workplace, it's challenging. It's difficult because unless you seek that kind of behavior out, you're not going to find it normally day to day sitting in the office. Pushing to be perfect. There's certain expectations of behavior, things like that in the military. I mean, how I dressed, how I cut my hair, whether or not I could put an earring in my ear, when I was supposed to show up to work, what my mission was for that day. Just about every aspect of my life was controlled by the federal government. Sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a way that wasn't so good, that was difficult. And then all of a sudden you enter the civilian world and you're entirely free to do basically whatever you want to do. And that can also be a challenge. And that the world is too laid back. There's nothing like sitting in a 3-vehicle convoy getting ready to pull out of a forward operating base, and you know that every decision you're going to make from the second you pull past that wire could result in life and death situations. That's something that's difficult to understand if you've not been there. But then you get out in the civilian world. And I remember sitting in a meeting, first place I worked, and we were trying to decide which copier to buy. And we had 3 copiers there. And we spent about an hour and a half talking about these copiers. And I was like, well, just please pick a copier. You know, they're all going to do the same thing. They're all going to make copies and they're going to scan. And let's just make a decision here. And you know what I'm talking about. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the military. So military service obligations. Most people don't realize that every American male is born with an 8-year military service obligation. Doesn't matter who you are. If you're a male born in the United States, you have an 8-year military service obligation to Uncle Sam. Now that military service obligation can be served voluntarily by either enlisting or commissioning in the military, or you could be drafted, or you could just not get called and not serve. And after age 37, that military service obligation just disappears. But that's why 18-year-olds still register for the draft, because the draft has not gone away. The draft's just turned off, and that military service obligation is still out there. And there are certain legislative efforts going on right now to expand that military service obligation to all natural-born U.S. citizens, so male and female alike. So by incurring that military service obligation, let's say I enlist in the military and I enlist for 3 years or 4 years, I'm going to owe the remainder of that military service obligation to Uncle Sam. And I'll show you in a little bit here how you continue to serve out even if you're not in the active component. Military rank structure, about 84%, the vast majority of the members of the military are what they call enlisted personnel. They may not necessarily have college. College isn't a requirement. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between enlisted warrant officers and commissioned officers over the next few slides. 14% are commissioned officers with college degrees, and it's mandatory to have a college degree to at least maintain your status as a commissioned officer. And a very small percentage of the military are what they call warrant officers, and we'll explain the difference between that in the next slide or two. Let's talk about enlisted. As I said, about 84% members of the military are enlisted, and they have specific job functions. They have that military occupational specialty that you may have heard that term before. For instance, when I first enlisted, I was a 13 Fox forward observer, or a 13F forward observer. So I was an artillery person that was assigned to an infantry or a cavalry unit, and I was the guy who ran around on patrol, calling in fire with radios, calling in artillery fire or close air support or things like that. But it's not unusual for enlisted individuals to have more than one MOS, depending on how long they stay in. So I ended up as a recruiter. I ended up doing some personnel work. I ended up as an inspector general. And most individuals that make a career out of the military are going to have more than one military occupational specialty. Your leadership responsibilities do increase as you climb the ranks. So if you're lower enlisted, E1 to E4, or a private or a specialist or an airman, you don't have a whole lot of leadership responsibilities. But once you make junior NCO, non-commissioned officer, or senior non-commissioned officer, from at E5 up to E9, then your leadership responsibility increases with every time you hit that new pay grade. In Army, they are that. They are specialists. They are non-commissioned officers. They are sergeants through command sergeant majors. In the Navy and the Coast Guard, they're called petty officers and chief petty officers. The warrant officers. These are highly specialized. They're like the ninjas of the armed forces. They're recruited heavily from enlisted ranks. Usually when an enlisted person gets E6 or E7, so they're just entering that senior non-commissioned officer structure, they get asked to apply for warrant officer school. It's a tough, it's a demanding school, but you're a specialist in your particular field. So you have very specialized helicopter pilots, for instance. Most of them are warrant officers. A lot of what they call the ODAs, the special forces teams, are led by warrant officers. They usually don't hold real command authority like a commissioned officer is, and I'll explain what command authority is in a second. But they are, like I said, very specialized. They're not generalists like commissioned officers. The Air Force doesn't have any warrant officers, and they're only about 2% of the current structure of the military. Commissioned officers. So they're your upper level managers, mid-level to upper level managers, similar to what you have in the civilian world. They do have bachelor's degrees. You can become a commissioned officer before you get a bachelor's degree by going to officer candidate school. You have to have at least, I think it's 60 credits. and then you have to complete your bachelor's degree before you can progress up the ranks. And if you don't complete your bachelor's degree, then you will lose your commission. The commission is an important title because it's granted by the President of the United States, so that individual can exercise command authority. So it's granted by the President, confirmed annually by the Senate, and command authority is a pretty important thing. Command authority gives an individual the right to have to apply the Uniform Code of Military Justice on someone. For instance, you could dock their pay. You could restrain someone to their quarters. You could assign them extra duties. And in capital cases, commissioned officers can make the decision to execute someone. So it's a very a lot of implications come along with that commission. That's why it is confirmed by the Senate and granted by the President. So in the Army, in the Marine Corps, and the Air Force, they have company grade officers, they have field grade officers, and they have general officers, those generals that wear the stars. And in the Navy, and the Coast Guard, they call them junior grade officers, mid grade officers, and senior grade officers. Talk about the relationship between the officer and the enlisted individual. So this young gentleman right here is second lieutenant. He's got about 2 years of experience in the military, probably has a bachelor's degree. He's got about 1,200 hours of military schooling and supervises any one person, maybe up to 20 people at the most, usually at that second lieutenant. But according to the Department of Defense, because that individual has a commission and is a commissioned officer, he outranks this senior enlisted individual who might have anywhere from 8 years to 40 years of experience, might not have a degree. But for instance, in my case, my joint services transcript showed that I had 209 credit hours of college equivalent military education, and could supervise anywhere from 100 to 8,000 people. But that senior non-commissioned officer is technically outranked by that young lieutenant and has to follow that lieutenant's lawful orders. But most junior officers understand that that non-commissioned officer is a source of a lot of experience, a lot of advice and guidance. They kind of follow you around for their first couple of years, don't challenge you too much because they know they can learn a tremendous amount from you. All right, the branches of the service. There's actually 5 branches now with the new Space Force, but it's almost a branch in name only right now. There's not a whole lot going on there, but the 4 branches that most people are familiar with: the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Air Force. And then there is the U.S. Coast Guard. The U.S. Coast Guard is not part of the Department of Defense. It's part of the Department of Homeland Security. Up until the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. Coast Guard actually fell under the auspices of the Department of Transportation. So it's never been considered a member of the Department of Defense, but they are considered an armed force because of their mission. And they are considered veterans when they get out of the Coast Guard. So the Army, I spent 22 years in the Army, 23 years in the Army. It's the oldest branch of service, and they are the ground pounders. They're the ground forces of the United States. Formed in 1775 as the Continental Army during the Revolution, and then that was subsequently replaced by the United States Army when we became the United States. And it's probably, I'm going to take another drink. Hang on. It's comprised of the active component Army, or what they call it, the active Army, and then 2 different reserve components, which is the Army National Guard and the Army Reserve. Now, each state or territory has the governor commands the Army and the Air National Guard within that state, but they can be called up federally by the president. But the U.S. Army Reserve, not the National Guard, but the U.S. Army Reserve, that is a federal entity. That falls under Title 10 U.S. Code. And so the state governor has no authority over any Army reserves or Navy reserves or Air Force reserves that reside in their state. That they only have command authority over those National Guard units. And the Army's mission is to fight and win our nation's wars by providing prompt, sustained land dominance across the full range of military operations and spectrum of conflict in support of the combatant commanders. Now, there are a lot of inter-service rivalries between those 5 branches, and in this case, most Marines think that soldiers are undertrained. Air Force thinks soldiers are just dirty because we sleep outside in holes all the time. Navy and Coast Guard are glad that they just don't have to do all the physical training that we do. They don't have to tuck their pants into their boots. They don't have to, they're a little more laid back than the Army or the Marine Corps. This is how the Army's goes all the way from a field army up there with 50,000 plus soldiers down to your squad level. That might anywhere from 4 to 10 soldiers in a squad. And the Army values are loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. And if you look at the first letter of each one of those values, you'll see that it's an acronym for leadership. Army values are instilled in the military individuals from the first day you enter basic training. That's one of the first things you memorize. And not only do you memorize what your Army values are, or whatever branch of service you're in, you're expected to live by those values. And they instill that in you from the day you enlist or are commissioned. All right, the United States Navy, it's the second largest branch of service. They've been around since the Revolution, since 1775. They have an active component Navy, and they also have a Navy Reserve, but they do not have a National Guard. There is no Naval National Guard that falls under the leadership of a governor. They augment air power for the United States Air Force, and they also transport Marines wherever Marines need to go, the United States Marine Corps. We call them Gator freighters. And their formal mission is to maintain, train, and equip combat-ready naval forces capable of winning wars, deterring aggression, maintaining freedom of the seas. And there's a lot of inter-service rivalries with that. The Army just doesn't pay much attention to the Navy because the Army and the Navy rarely work together. The Coast Guard's a little jealous because the Navy gets all the big boats and the Coast Guard only gets the little ones. The Marines just basically considered them bus drivers, and because that's what as far as they're concerned, that's what the Navy's there for. Is get me a ride to where I need to go. And the Air Force thinks they're crazy to land airplanes on aircraft carriers because Air Force pilots will not do that. And this is the composition of the Navy's pretty simple. If you look over there under the Secretary of the Navy, you do have the Chief of Naval Operations, but you also have the Commandant of the Marine Corps. And we'll talk a little bit about the Marines next. Here's the Navy values: honor, courage, and commitment. They're a little more succinct than the Army values. We got 7, they got 3. All right. Semper Fi, the United States Marine Corps. Semper Fidelis, you'll always hear Marines say Semper Fi. That's short for Semper Fidelis, which means always faithful. They fall under the Department of the Navy, much to their chagrin. They are actually part of the United States Navy. They're not a standalone branch of service. They were organized in a bar, actually, in the East Coast in 1775, Tunn's Tavern. They were originally an entirely amphibious force. They literally fired from the bulwarks of ships on other ships, did amphibious landings, and that's still the primary mission of the United States Marine Corps. But with the global war on terrorism, we've seen that mission somewhat change. We've seen Marines have to actually occupy land, and that usually isn't the case. In all our previous conflicts, you look at World War II in the Pacific, the Marines would take an island and then, through shock and awe, and then the Army would actually occupy that captured territory. But in Iraq, Afghanistan, you'll see a lot more Marines that are actually occupying a certain battle space and maintaining control of that battle space. The mission of the United States Marines is the seizure, defense of advanced naval bases and other land operations to support naval campaigns. The development of tactics, techniques, and equipment used by amphibious landing forces, and such other duties as the president may direct. Some of the inter-service rivalries of the Marines, soldiers think Marines eat crayons. That's always been a joke, but are actually a little bit jealous because Marines are a lot tougher. And if you ever seen a Marine Corps recruiting commercial, they do carry swords and they fight dragons. And Army recruiting commercials, we don't get to see any dragons. Just about everybody else, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, they just kind of avoid the Marines because they can be scary troops. So, as mentioned, under the Navy structure, they just kind of fall under the Navy. They have operating forces, they have support establishments like air wings, artillery, and then they also have a Marine Forces reserves, but they do not have a Marine Corps National Guard. Same values as the Navy: honor, courage, and commitment. The U.S. Air Force, the youngest branch of the military, started as the Army Air Corps back in 1947. They originally were the Army Air Corps, and then in 1947 they became the U.S. Armed Forces. They do have an active component, they do have an Air Force Reserve, and they have an Air National Guard. And as I mentioned, the Army and the Air National Guard are commanded by the governor of the state or territory. And the Air Force Reserve, they're just like the Army Reserve. Those are Title 10 USC federal troops that don't fall under the auspices or leadership of the governor. They deliver sovereign options for the defense of the United States of America and its global interest to fly and fight in air, space, and now in cyberspace. Now we'll see what's going to happen with the new Space Force, because defense of the space was always the responsibility of the U.S. Air Force, and now that's switching over to the Space Command. So the Space Force, we'll see how that happens. Some of the inter-service rivalries is everybody kind of teases the Chair Force because they think, to be honest, they haven't made. When I was in the Army, I was stationed on an Air Force base for 3 years, and I would go to their chow hall every Friday because they had all-you-could-eat shrimp buffet, big mounds of ice with shrimp all over, peeling it shrimp. And I had been in the Army probably 17 years at that time, and I had never seen one shrimp in the Army ever. There's the composition of the Air Force. MAGCOM is a major command, and then they have wings, groups, squadrons. Here in Michigan, we've got 3 Air Force bases. They're Air National Guard bases. We've got one up in Alpena, we've got one down in Selfridge, and we've got one in Battle Creek. There's A-10s down in Battle Creek. There's in Selfridge, they have KC-130, 135 refuelers. And up north, I think they got F-16s up there and some refuelers. That's their values: integrity first, service before self, excellence in all we do. Last but certainly not least is the Coast Guard. And as I mentioned, they fall under the Department of Homeland Security. They are considered an armed force, and they also are the only branch of the service that has real law enforcement capabilities. The other branches of military service, they can be federalized, but we tend to stay away from true law enforcement duties. That's not true with the Air Force, with the Coast Guard, with their mission to protect the public, the environment, and the United States economic and security interests in any maritime region in which those interests may be at risk, including international waters and America's coasts, ports, and inland waterways. The Air Force is a great branch of service. I was always a little jealous when I was in the Navy because I had friends that joined the Coast Guard when I joined the Navy, and I was over in the Mediterranean and on a submarine, and that sounded cool, but I had friends that were stationed at Lake Michigan or Lake Superior, and basically living on a beach. So yeah, they kind of got it made, and their values are honor, respect, and devotion to duty. All right, let's talk a little bit about the difference between the active and reserve components. There are big cultural differences between those two. The active component, there are full-time armed forces, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. That's a full-time job, but they also get full-time benefits for that. They are the permanent forces of the military. And right now there's about 1.3 million members of the active component. So you're talking about the active Army, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, Air Force, and Navy. Some of the benefits of being in the active component, and I've done both. I've done reserve and active. It's very competitive salary and bonuses for enlistment and re-enlistment. Most people don't realize that the pay is pretty good in the military. Now, when you're a private, the pay is not very good. When you're a specialist, the pay is not very good. But once you get up into those NCO and senior NCO ranks, it can be very competitive with the civilian world, and in some ways more competitive because they don't base it so much on your education level. They base it on your skill level, your experiences, things like that. Great healthcare, some of the best healthcare in the world for active component members and their families. They get a very generous vacation package. Everybody, doesn't matter if you're a 4-star general or an E1 private, everybody gets 30 days off a year. Living on post can be really cool. Living on base is a lot of privileges, discounted groceries, tax-free, recreation opportunities, horseback riding, daycare, movie theaters, little things that make a big difference, like a mechanic's garage where you can pull your car in and use their lifts and use their tools and run it by the hour. Just lots of little benefits of living on post. It is safe. It's a gated community, and a very generous retirement package. There was very few institutions where you could just do 20 years and get a full retirement, regardless of how old you were. That's not the case nowadays. What they do now is they have a blended retirement where they do have a pension, but they also do have a 401k option. Now that is good because let's say you do 8 years in the military and you decide you want to get out. Previous to this blended retirement coming out last year, you didn't get anything. If you did not do 20, you didn't get any kind of severance at all, unless it was a medical severance. But now an individual can join for 6 years and they'll walk away with something. Everybody walks away with something now. So there's good and bad. Some of the stresses of being in the active component is permanent change of station, usually, especially in the Army and the Marine Corps. About every 3 years, you're going to get a call from your branch manager and you're going to get a new assignment somewhere. Now, they do that for a reason. They do that because they want fresh thinking, fresh ideas. They don't want people to become stagnant in place. There's a tremendous amount of temporary duty that can pull from your family time. You might have to do a field exercise for 30 days. You come back home for 7 days, and then you might have to go to a 6-week school, and then you might come home for a week, and then you might have to go back out and do another field exercise. So that temporary duty can be somewhat taxing. Frequent deployments overseas, especially with the operational tempo that we've had since the global war on terror started. My son, he just retired this year after 20 years, and I think he's had 6 deployments. And Jeff Cassidy, who introduced me, I think he's got 7 or 8 deployments. So frequent deployments overseas, especially nowadays. There is that risk of death or injury. It's a dangerous job. Those behavioral expectations I talked about, what t-shirt can I wear? Can I grow a beard or a mustache? And living overseas. Now, living overseas sounds cool, but that can be a challenge also. I mean, you have to learn a new culture. You have to assimilate into a different society, into a different culture, and so does your family in many instances. And then 3 years later, bam, you're back in Fort Polk, Louisiana. So the reserve component, they are part-time soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and they usually do 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year. That was the original model, but just like the active component with the global war on terrorism ramping up, training periods tend to be a lot longer now. They can be activated by the president to augment the active component. There's actually 10 components of the reserves: the U.S. Army National Guard and the Air National Guard, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps Reserve, Coast Guard Reserve, the Individual Ready Reserve, the Inactive National Guard, and the Retired Reserve. So that individual, hang on, let me look at the next slide. That Individual Ready Reserve, I wanted to point that out because remember when I talked about military service obligation, that every American male has a 8-year military service obligation? If you do 4 years enlisted, or let's say you get drafted for 3 years, but let's just say you enlist for 4 years or you commission for 4 years, when you get out, you're still going to owe the remainder of that military service obligation to the government. So that's what they transfer you into what they call the Individual Ready Reserve, where you can grow your hair out, you can get fat if you want, you can hang out, you can do whatever you want, but they got your name on the list, and if they need to call you back, they're going to call you back. And that's happened quite frequently this past 15 years. When I went to Iraq, there was a member of the Individual Ready Reserve that had been called out after he'd been in the Individual Ready Reserve for 5 years and got called out and was involuntarily activated. The Inactive National Guard is the same way. If you do not complete your 8-year military service obligation, you can transfer into the Inactive National Guard. And then there's me, I'm a retired reserve. So once you're retired reserve, it doesn't matter about your military service obligation. They could call me back up anytime. Doesn't matter how old I am. The oldest person I ever saw serving was over 70 years old, and that was a psychologist in Iraq. And he was serving gladly. He didn't mind that he'd been called out of the inactive or out of the retired reserve, but they can pull you up. The difference between the National Guard and the Reserve, the Federal Reserve, is that National Guard does have that dual mission. When a National Guard member enlists, they raise their hand and they swear to defend the Constitution of the state of Michigan and the United States, and to obey the orders of the governor and the president. Where if you're joining the Army Reserve, you don't take an oath to defend your state. You just take an oath to defend the nation. That's because National Guard are what they call Title 32 U.S. Code, as opposed to Title 10 U.S. Code. And National Guard troops aren't subject to the Posse Comitatus law. They're not subject to that constitutional requirement that bans quartering federal troops in residences, using them for law enforcement purposes, having active component troops operational within the borders of the United States. Now, exceptions can be made. Exceptions can be made by Congress in instances of natural disaster or civil unrest, and we have seen some of that recently, and that you will see some federal troops that do get activated for in-state service, but it takes congressional approval. And the reserves, those Title 10 assets, like I mentioned, they just have a federal mission. Okay, some of the reserve component benefits. They get paid for drill and for annual training, and it's not bad pay. For every 4 hours of drill time you do, you get a full day Army pay. They do have pretty good re-enlistment bonuses, $20,000, $25,000 in some cases. They can opt in for a limited health care coverage, even though they're part-time soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. They do have access to military installations to do shopping, to take advantage of some of those perks. And unfortunately, in Michigan, we just don't have hardly any active component. We've got TACOM down in Detroit, and we've got Selfridge, and that's about it when it comes to being able to go to the commissary or go to the exchange to go shopping. But very generous retirement packages. The Reserve and the National Guard are about the only employer I know that actually will pay you more when you retire than you made when you enlisted. But the thing with the reserves is you can't collect your pension when you retire until you hit 60 years old. They're gray area retirees. So if you're 32 when you get out and retire, or 38 when you get out and retire, you're not going to see any of your pension until you're 60. Where if you're active component, you start seeing your pension the day after you retire. That'll take some couple months to get it to you, but you're eligible for it. Some of the stressors of reserve component, of course, mobilization. There's nothing like, having to tell your employer, I just got called off, boss. I'm taking off for anywhere from 9 to 18 months, depending on his school and training. The reserve components go to the exact same schools in many instances that the active component does. So you have to carve time out of your life to go to those. It might be a 4-week school. It might be a 10-week school. It might be a 50-week school. And you do have to carve time out of your civilian life to get that military education. And I put demobilization as a stressor. Now, you wouldn't think coming off of mobilization would be a stressor, but it actually is. When you're in the active component and you return from a deployment, you return with the brothers and sisters of where you served. You're a cohesive unit. You integrate back into the United States or back into your military installation, wherever it is. And there's a large support structure out there to help you cope with that demobilization. Where if you're a member of the Guard and Reserve, you might come back with your unit, and then 4 days later, you're sitting in your living room, sitting in front of the fireplace, and your teammates aren't sitting there with you. So that can be stressful. All right, I think that's about it. I'm going to turn my head a little bit to look at the chat, see if there's any questions out there. All right, that's it. Doesn't look like any questions.
There is one question that came through, Dave.
Okay.
Shoot, where did I put it? There it is. So first, I'd like to thank you for your service and your time and expertise today. Thank you for your dedication to our service members. I'm an Army veteran, MOS 37 Fox, PSYOPs, and volunteer with the Love a Vet Michigan project. During initial transition, we've seen great success with steering our vets toward more independent careers like CDL drivers. What are the top 3 to 5 career paths or industries do you recommend for the average soldier transitioning into civilian life?
Law enforcement is a big one. If you look at the Michigan State Police, you look at a lot of your local law enforcement agencies, there's a large percentage of veterans that go into law enforcement. I think it's because it's a paramilitary structure, very similar to what they experienced in the military. I think one of the underutilized career paths is apprenticeships. A veteran can utilize their GI Bill while they're in an apprenticeship program. So here they're getting paid. They're on the pay scale, but they also get a stipend that augments their pay. And it's kind of underutilized, and we're pushing more and more veterans into the apprenticeship path. And continuing education, that not necessarily for immediate, because the GI Bill is one heck of a deal. That post 9/11 GI Bill, that's 36 months of schooling paid for, 100% of your tuition. And then if you decide to continue your service in the Guard or Reserve, which many service members do, that's also augmented by state-funded tuition assistance. So, before you jump right into a job, take a look at your alternative career opportunities and pathways. That's advice I give to every transitioning service member.
That's a great point. Not only is the GI Bill underutilized across all services, using the GI Bill for apprenticeships is something that is also underutilized. Everybody thinks that, well, I have a GI Bill, but I don't want to go to college. Well, you can use your GI Bill for registered apprenticeships, and I think that's like I said, I think that's a very underutilized area of the GI Bill, and I think it's something that a lot of veterans could use if they kind of thought like, oh, I don't need to go to college. I could get an apprenticeship. So that's a great point.
Great.
Oh, go ahead, Dave. I'm sorry.
I was just going to point out these are great. Traditional the healthcare industry is industry, this industry, agribusiness. They're expanding. They're expanding all of the traditional that traditional majority of apprenticeships. So.
Good point. You broke up a little bit there, but expanding outside of the traditional healthcare, things like that. Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Well, thank you, Oakland County, for sponsoring, and like I said, pleasure to present, and we'll see you guys next year. Thank you.
Well, this ends our presentation today. I'd like to thank Dave, our presenter. We appreciate your time. We appreciate everyone's time for joining us. I hope you've had some good takeaways and will enjoy all the features of our conference. The exhibitor networking break is next. So take time after this session to video chat with exhibitors or watch their informational videos, or go to the networking tab to be randomly paired with another attendee for 2 minutes to meet new people. Thanks very much.